he's going to be happy to answer a few of our questions as well. So Alex, why don't you take it from me and entertain the audience?
I'm just going to open up my laptop here and just hope it works. I'm sure it does. All right. You all set? Oh, there we go. Let me just put this in slideshow mode and we should be off and running. I'm going to go back to the first slide and we'll just get underway. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's so great to be here in Valencia, Spain. I'm Alex, and so wanted to just give you an idea of how we think about the community right now, how we think of where the trends are, and I think it's really reflected in our reader survey and some of the top posts that we've seen over the past month and past week. We've been tracking more closely the posts that are doing well. So what I thought I'd first do is give that reader perspective about what is interesting to them, and then we'll get into a little bit of the stories that we're seeing that are popping up of interest. Please feel free to ask any questions if you're interested in trends that you're curious about, but what we're seeing, this is a chance, I think, for people to get ideas about maybe their own blog post or maybe some confirmation about direction and trends and such. So look forward to your questions. So we do an annual reader survey. We start the process in the fourth quarter, and we get it ready to present by the beginning of the year. The goals really are to find out, for us, who are the key audiences out there that we're really trying to target. What is the content that they value, and what is the topics that they prefer? It really helps us with our own editorial direction, and it gives us an idea of what we should be covering in the new year. This also helps our sponsors' content marketing initiatives, which really is done through contributions. And what you'll see here is a lot of posts by sponsor contributors. What we're really seeing is like a confirmation of the past several years where a lot of our readers are actually, they identify as back-end developers and architects. And one thing I think you'll see in some of these posts that I've collected is that connection between the web and the back-end. We're seeing a lot more examples of that in the stories that we write as we see more companies and more communities start to adopt these practices. They want depth. People really are interested in wanting that in-depth stuff. So we really are putting a more focus on tutorials and that type of material. We're going to be publishing ebooks, for example. It's really good, I think, lesson not just for us, but for I think anyone who's in the business of or just has part of their job responsibility to develop content. It's really a way to gain visibility. And one of the things that I thought about when we first started the new stack was how are we going to get our name out there, and how are we really going to tell our story? And I just thought, well, gosh, what better way to do it than write blog posts? And that's what we do, and that really serves us very well. It helps us keep our engine going and interested in what we do. Kubernetes and DevOps are still the top topics of interest. I think we'll see that. That's really interesting too for us because it speaks to our own DNA. We really started focusing on container architectures back in 2014, and we still do that, and we still have that focus today. This survey was conducted in late November. You can see that the participants vary, but we always make sure we get enough good sample size to be able to have meaningful results. So we ask people what defines their role, and I think this is always interesting for me. We see developers and software engineers right up at the top, but we're starting to see some of some interesting corollaries. So one thing I always point to is DevOps. Now DevOps only represents 7.2% of the people who identify themselves as DevOps, but I think what you find is that a lot of people actually consider themselves doing DevOps work when they are developers or software engineers. And where do they and really what are they developing on? And look at that. It's like 69% are developing for the web and the back end, and 61% or so for the cloud. Server infrastructure, 38%, and then it goes down from there. This one way at the bottom is my favorite topic though lately, WebAssembly. And how many people went to WebAssembly Day yesterday? Did anyone go? Well, if you're unfamiliar, it's a fascinating time because what we're starting to see is with the evolution of container architectures and the evolution of just the edge, so to speak, we're starting to see a lot more interest in WebAssembly because it's very portable, it's very secure, and it's very, very lightweight. So I expect this will grow over the time. We actually called 2022 going to be the year of WebAssembly, but I think in terms of its real practicality and what we're actually seeing out there, it's actually very low. I attribute that in part to the dev experience that the WebAssembly has. It's just not that. It's just still very young. When we look at this, we always see, it was one of the interesting surprises for me when we first started the new stack was how many people actually said that they work for companies of very large size. And that's pretty much what we see year in and year out. That the people reading the new stack are really looking to this because they need that information. They need to have those insights and trends. But if you start adding up these different, these numbers, you'll see that there's some corollary though to like the top half, where we still see a lot of people who, if you combine like self-employed, not working, or people who have 2 to 10 or 11 to 15 employees, you start to see the numbers add up. So there's an interesting balance there. This is we always want to make sure that we're doing well in our work, and what we really focus on at the new stack is explanation analysis of at-scale development, deployment, and management. We really want to make sure that people understand what the topics are about. People need that explanation. They really need it to help understand, what they're doing. So for us, the news is important, but we don't live by the news like a lot of news organizations. So how are people using the new stack? They're staying informed of trends. They're getting the latest news. They're identifying new tools and services. We don't do a lot of like how-to kind of stuff, but it is actually in demand out there, and we might see more of that as time goes on. People don't really come to us for informing a purchasing decision, but I think there's kind of the corollary of informing a purchasing decision and staying informed of trends and getting the latest news and identifying new tools and services, which does correlate to something like informing a purchasing decision. Again, it's depth that people really want. You can see that people really want to see these tutorial articles. They want to see article series on specific topics. They want the detailed analysis, the case studies, the ebooks. So that's the kind of information that they're really looking for. Down at the bottom, podcasts. Interesting thing about podcasts is like there's almost like a separate audience for us. They're almost like there's some crossover, but what we found is like a lot of people are just coming to us for the podcast. And I remember in the early days, people didn't even know that we had a site. What topics do you want to see us covering this year? DevOps, Kubernetes, GitOps, observability, cloud infrastructure services, infrastructure as code. And again, what I'm always looking forward to is to trying to understand, what about serverless and function as a service? Why is that not gaining a lot of popularity? Well, if you think about it, there's a lot of topics that are related in DevOps and multiple cloud hybrid architectures and Kubernetes that have serverless or function as a service components to them. So I think there's something to look at here and like getting an understanding of really what people are saying is like the top things, but understanding that there's a little bit more nuance and context when you're looking at some of the other topics that maybe not as popular, but maybe actually reflected in some of the topics that are of primary interest. If you look at what ranks in terms of interest comparatively, you'll see that Kubernetes has actually gone down in ranking, which is for us a sign that Kubernetes and containers are still of super interest. They're very mainstream now. But what we're also seeing is that there's a new interest in other types of stories, other types of trends. And we see that, for instance, with the kind of the integration of the back end and the front end, which is interesting. Other trends here that I think are of interest, like if you look at observability there, look at the jump that it's made right there from 19 to 6. I mean, that speaks again to the very complex architectures that you're starting to see emerge. Microservices are very complex to develop. You need something to go beyond monitoring the application to be able to do some observability on the components themselves. The declining interest, microservices and serverless, databases, service meshes, and so those are the ones that are on the decline. Again, I'm not so sure about the serverless one. I mean, I'm a little skeptical of that because I think it's integrated into a lot of the kind of work that people are doing. I think you may see some increasing interest with serverless and fast as we start looking at WebAssembly a little bit more. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on in that world. Microservices, I think people just have gotten tired of the term, but still the complexity is there, and the explanation of the complexity is important. This is one of the more interesting topics where you can see it by job role. I've always find this slide of particular interest, and what you can do here is when you look at the job roles that people have. For instance, I know a lot of you probably, maybe I should take a quick poll. It's like, how many people here consider themselves developers? Software engineers, back-end architects? Okay. A lot of storage administrators, or I don't know. I mean, maybe someone can, maybe, is there a title that I haven't mentioned that you associate yourself with? Anyone? Oh, okay. Well, I guess I'm 100% on that one. So if you look at DevOps, for instance, IT management's not going to have as much of an interest in DevOps. But if you look at artificial intelligence and machine learning for IT operations, it's the #1 topic. This is a slide that we look at quite a bit to get an idea of what people are interested in. Let's get into the top posts and then we'll finish up. So we look at top 10 stories of the week and top 10 stories of the month. Here's kind of a look at kind of the stories, and I think there's some reflection in the reader survey results. So a new architecture for APIs was an interesting story about really the rise of GraphQL. Svelte has become extremely popular as an alternative framework, and we're always seeing a lot of interest in JavaScript. Best practices for microservices authorization. This to me shows a more advanced look at microservices and how people are viewing microservices now. They're looking for more in-depth perspectives on it. So, for instance, if you look at that article, one of the pillars that they describe is rollback, RBAC, and so I've been talking to more people in the CI/CD world about about rollback, and there's a lot of interesting kind of developments there using machine learning to do automatic rollbacks, because that's really going to be much more important as microservices get more complex. Some of the other stories in here, programming languages always do well for us. The 5 pillars of cloud architectures, I think that might be related to the headline a little bit. What is a microservices catalog and why do you need one? Again, it's interesting that microservices rank so low, but when you get into the depth of things, it's a little different story. AI development needs to focus more on data and less on models. We're hearing a lot of that. Platform engineering infrastructure meets the dev experience, and Red Hat embraces DevSecOps. If you look at the top stories for the month, one thing that we do is, like, on the weekends we do a lot of cultural coverage, and so this comical coder envisions the worst programming is a great example of this. This radical story is another kind of example of, I think there's some more interest in decentralization. I think Web3 is such a volatile term, but this really speaks, I think, to like, the interest in different ways to kind of manage your development. And Radical takes more of like an identity-based approach, which is pretty interesting. Low code, we're seeing more interest in that. Python, we're actually doing more of series like on things for people who are new to the world of programming. So Python, it fits into that. And then there's some of these others. I was going to just quickly look at some of these stories. So here's one. Here's a story by Anand. And this is again the new architecture for APIs. And Anand Jagran is super smart guy, and I would recommend reading this story if you're interested in how APIs are working. He kind of goes into, I think one of the most interesting parts of this article is how he thinks of GraphQL APIs as almost like this tree, as you can see. And he says, it can be, there's almost like these next level subgraphs that actually allow for a lot of different ways to be able to manage policy, for example. This is one of my example, I think, of like what we focus on such technical, serious type of stories, but we really think that there's the community out there is actually quite diverse. And this was a story about someone who did a let me look at here again. He did a comical coder story, and if you look at this. Let me get back to that. I love this. He says, early on, Rendell turned his attention to Python, which calls generally very good and very reasonable, but then he displayed two identical-looking blocks of code, one of which throws an error because its white space consists of a mix of tabs and spaces. Annoyances shares with F#, Haskell, and OCaml. So Rendell's language took things even further. We're going to use 2 spaces for indentation, but if you're indenting by 4 spaces, then you use a tab. I just thought it was pretty. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that's actually very popular on the new stack. That kind of whimsical look at things. I thought this story might be interesting to the group here. It's about really storage as code in the next steps of for DevOps. It might be something you want to go check out. And what he's talking about is that. There's this logical trend to follow the popular Kubernetes abstraction. But there's also this widespread demand for infrastructure to be generic enough for everyone to access what they need to build without having to bug infrastructure engineers all the time. And the story goes into a lot of the developers have historically had to go to IT to actually, ask for storage. And this is a step in a direction where maybe we can actually bring more DevOps functions into that whole process. This is not about code so much anymore. It's really about the people and how to make them put their best foot forward. I think I did 2 stories on that. Well, we'll go to another one. And, I thought I would just finish with this last example about how we're seeing just such a new interest in front-end development. And how it integrates with back-end development. And this is a very popular framework, JavaScript framework, and it just, I think, reflects kind of the interest in the community to see more stories about how the front-end and the back-end architectures fit. That about covers it for me. Does anyone have any kind of questions about the new stack or a question I can answer about the stories? All right, well, thank you very much for your time.